there is a bigger conversation and a bigger context I think that we need to look into here, which is just I think it's fair to call it the irresponsible rapid expansion side of things, and that side of this discussion, because this is something that shouldn't be ignored. And I think there is some context that isn't being spoken about at all, which is Rona happened, and with that we were all indoors, right? People who were normally working, at very least in a lot of the West, furloughed, and without a job, given some pay by the government, made sure that you were able to sit and exist. You didn't have to pay money for transport to work. You didn't have to worry about a certain number of things. So you had the ability to spend more on video games or anything else that you were doing while you were inside. But video games was a big deal back then because, suddenly the only way you could actually interact with people on the regular who were outside of your own house was through digital means. And so video games were a natural pair for that. And a bunch of companies looked at this surge in revenue, and it feels like they ignored the fact that it would not go on forever, right? There were these massive reports of revenue bumping all the way up in 2020 and 2021 when we had all of the lockdowns and whatnot, and companies massively expanded themselves in that time. And this matters because it then pushes into the next few years. And now we're starting to see, as of 2023, 2024, those companies are seeing the contraction that naturally comes from everything returning to normal. And tech is feeling that generally too. It's not the only factor that's gone into this, of course, but it seems as though there are some that have bought into this a whole lot more than others. And I think it's clear to say that Bungie's leadership fell into that trap.
Yeah.
They sat there and saw Destiny as a thing that would continue to be able to support this rapid expansion, and they thought that it was going to be a continuous gravy train, and it very clearly was not. Regardless, even if they just expanded to only Payback, I think it would have actually been fine, but they then had to make a big offering to Sony to make sure that their company was saved, if that makes sense.
Marathon?
I mean, no, it was as in the merger.
Right.
The $3.6 billion merger. Yeah. Because, the alternative, according to some, that I believe Jason Schreier interviewed, was that it was either do the big merger or the company faces insolvency.
Yeah.
So they were making these rapid expansion projects in a big gamble, and it feels as though, to me, the picture is we've done all of this stuff, we've dug ourselves in too deep, let's use this wide portfolio of stuff we've partially built but not completed to convince Sony that our company's value is way bigger than it is, and let's pray that we continue to hit those revenue targets when we make that big merger announcement.
Yeah.
And it just didn't pan out. Now, again, that's one person's perspective and opinion. I don't know if that's correlation to causation. It could be that those are separate series of events that don't really work out, but in my mind, that's kind of the path that leadership has taken, and it speaks to being out of touch with the real world. It speaks to a complete lack of touch with reality to do with the basic fundamentals of what people were doing while the pandemic was going on. And I think it also is overly ambitious without much care for how the studio was doing. And I think it's even clearer when you put it in parallel as a comparison to other game dev studios. And I mean, I'm going to double check this because I want to make sure I get this right, but the immediate competitor and the comparison that people have been making a lot, especially in the last few days, is to Warframe, because it's made by Digital Extreme. They also create one of the larger looter games on the market right now. And, they also went through the same conditions that Bungie did.
I'll say while you look that up, like even on top of that, everything you said, I don't even think that's just one person's opinion. I think that's just a fact. But as well as that, as well as people the consumers having more money to spend, as a more macroeconomy level, interest rates were low, so cash was cheap, so companies were going on spending sprees, and we heard that Bungie were going on spending sprees. They bought like a whole new separate studio. They also expanded they bought, I don't know whether it was a studio or a PR agency in Amsterdam as well, but they really, as well as all these projects, they really expanded, and a lot of companies went on spending sprees because, again, cash was cheap and interest rates are low. So it kind of lulled everyone into these false senses of just liquid cash that we can just be invincible and be like how things were before the pandemic, but things kind of snapped back to reality very quickly. And it just, yeah, it seems like they had good intentions. Obviously, their plan was to have lots of projects and lots of games and lots of even outside of games, the movie and TV stuff with Netflix and maybe even books and stuff like that. But it seems like they definitely, well, it's definitely not just seems, it is a fact that they obviously overextend themselves.
Yeah. And, to give you an example of the direct parallel, almost everyone in big tech went through layoffs. The Warframe developer Digital Extreme, by comparison as well. But across their whole studio, they spun out into Wayfinder, which was one other project which actually had a series of gameplay betas. It was a finished thing. Like, players were in these games in their early access states. And, it was one of those things where DE was looking to do the model they typically do, which is build your games out with feedback from the fans and make it so that people who are early supporters get rewarded, and then build it into consistent products over time. That's how Warframe has been for over a decade, and it's been successful. But even they expanded a bit too quickly, but the numbers show a completely different respect to it, and this is what I wanted to touch on. Bungie now, even in their first round of layoffs, it was something like 120 odd people. Now 220 in this second round of layoffs. Total of something close to 350 people have left the studio, including smaller departures between those two big rounds of layoffs, right? 350. Across the entirety of their time laying people off, DE has only laid off 30 people. Now granted, smaller studio, fewer people, but regardless, the numbers alone speak to the degrees of caution that were clearly taken by some studios versus others. And there are some studios that clearly had a responsibility to their workers in mind and didn't manage to fully meet the bar, but at very least weren't betting the whole house. I mean, it goes hand in hand with the other side of things, which is all of these developers at Bungie, the team of 1,300, most of them were on Destiny, but a huge proportion of them were still on other projects that were not making money at the time.
Yep.
And they were basically scraping the Destiny team as thin as they could so they could make all these other incubation projects. And this is the other thing to keep in mind. Incubating a new project, be it a franchise, a new game, something that is already existing and you need to finish off, doesn't matter what it is, even just the research of what you can do with that and to make that a good product, that's expensive. The amount of money that would have gone into making Marathon a new franchise, I say a new franchise, a returning franchise with a new format alone, staggering cost. I don't even need to know the numbers to know that the cost of that would be staggering, because that's how it works in game dev. But if you were doing 3, 4 of these at a time, if you had Marathon, if you had Gummy Bears, if you had Payback, if you had, quote, 2 other unannounced projects that were also canned, I believe was the wording from Jason Schreier, suddenly you can see what this was. This was like butter scraped over too much bread, as Bilbo Baggins would have put it. Like they were essentially taking their studio and throwing so much on the table to gamble with that there wasn't enough to actually support that when none of those bets paid off. The only thing they have left is Marathon, and Gummy Bears is technically now its own thing under SIE. Yeah. So yeah, it's different now. It doesn't necessarily come back to Bungie, and it's 3 dead projects. Yeah. And a ton of money wasted and a ton of people laid off for nothing.
Yeah, the
useless risk taking.
The only thing actually bringing in revenue would have been Destiny 2, and none of these. You're just pouring money in, and also developers' time, which is more money and resources, and none of it's coming back. So